Okay, good morning, everybody. Today, we are going to deal with a very interesting and very important topic, that is the development of heart. You have heard of many defects of the heart during your genetics class or among your relatives or something. You have heard that child had a congenital heart defect or something like that. Now you have seen the heart, at least through the video. You have learned about the heart. Now you should know, how is that heart developing? What are the possible defects that can arise? Then the third thing, very important, you might have heard of ASD, VSD, that is the septal defects inside the atria and ventricle and all. Then there are some rare defects like the great arteries. The artery has been transposed, means, and that you will learn. Though rare, when you go to the pediatric cardiac unit, you will see the patients with these defects, and you ought to know which are the more dangerous ones, which need important attention and all. Okay, with this introduction, we now can start with the development of heart. There is a peculiarity for the development of heart, that it is the first organ system to start functioning. And you do an ultrasound earliest by 5th week itself. You will get the cardiac activity by the ultrasonography. Actually, it is found to function, it is known to function from 22nd or 23rd day of intrauterine development. That is at the end of 3rd week or at the beginning of 4th week. But it will be a bit late when you will be able to pick it at the ultrasound. Okay, now about the development of heart. There are 3 cell lines by the end of 3rd week. There was ectoderm, endoderm and mesoderm. And I hope you know the heart develops from the mesoderm. Never confuse the heart, whether it is endocardium, myocardium or epicardium, they are developing from the mesoderm. It is mesodermal in origin. It develops in the cardiogenic area. And have you heard of cardiogenic area before? This was your trilaminar germ disc after the development of intraembryonic coelom. Okay, here the cranial most part was the septum transversum, from which develops the diaphragm. Then this was the brocaudal plate, later to be known as buccopharyngeal membrane. So in between this brocaudal plate and the septum transversum, there was the mesoderm. That area was the cardiogenic area, and the most convex part of the intraembryonic coelom lies here. So that part of the coelom will give rise to the pericardial cavity. Among the 3 body cavities, it has been marked there. So that region is the cardiogenic area. This is another picture where you have taken a sagittal section. Here also you can see this is the septum transversum and this is the buccopharyngeal membrane. And in between the buccopharyngeal and septum transversum, you can see the cardiogenic area and that pericardial coelom, the part of the intraembryonic coelom. Okay, which divide that coelom, divide that mesoderm into 2, a splanchnopleuric which lies ventral and a somatopleuric which lies dorsal. Okay, And here you can see the heart develop in the ventral to that coelom. It is in the splanchno-pleuric mesoderm. Two endothelial heart tubes are formed. It is endothelial heart tube, but it is not endodermal. I am stressing it because many students used to confuse between the two. It is endothelium, but it is derived from the mesoderm itself. Okay, so two endothelial heart tubes are formed in the splanchno-pleuric mesoderm in the cardiogenic area. Then, the head part undergoes a rotation. It is called head folding or the cranial folding. And after cranial folding, see the picture. This cardiac area undergoes a 180-degree rotation so that this splanchno-pleuric mesoderm and the cardiac tubes developing inside come dorsal to, now it is dorsal to the pericardial coelom. Okay, you can see the foregut. So now the cardiac tube or the heart tube is ventral to the foregut but dorsal to the pericardial coelom or the pericardial cavity. Okay, this heart tube has got an arterial end which continues as the dorsal aorta, one on either side of midline, and there is a venous end where the veins will be draining from the developing embryo, from the umbilical vein, from the yolk sac. All these veins will be draining to one end of this heart tube, that is called the venous end. Okay, so these are the two endothelial heart tube, and one end distally, upper part, it is the arterial end which is continuing as the dorsal aorta. Ventral part, lower down, it is seen in blue color. It is the venous end where these veins will be draining. The entire structure is the same, only thing the direction of flow. Okay, later these two heart tubes unite craniocaudally. Okay, craniocaudally, from the head end to the tail end, from the arterial end to the venous end. Now a single heart tube is formed. Okay, so from cranial to caudal, the caudal part remains 2. Then now this single heart tube is in the dorsal to the coelom or the pericardial cavity, and now it starts to invaginate the coelom. Okay, when it invaginates, similarly, similar to the pleura where the lung invaginates, the same, the serous cavity, now it has got a visceral layer that closely covers the heart tube and a parietal layer, the outer part. In between these two is the pericardial cavity with the pericardial fluid. Okay, so you can see the heart tube from the splanchno-pleuric mesoderm, it starts to invaginate the coelom. While it invaginates, there will be, you can see, around the tube, this splanchno-pleuric mesoderm will produce a jelly-like substance. It is called the myoepicardial mantle. Myoepicardial mantle, from which it is going to develop the myocardium and epicardium. Okay, now you have got an endothelial heart tube. Then around that there will be the myoepicardial mantle derived from the mesoderm, and still around that there will be the cavity, the pericardial cavity with a splanchno-pleuric layer and the parietal or the visceral layer and the somatic layer. Okay, and you can see it is hang down so that the visceral layer, it is becoming continuous with the parietal layer. That fold, double layered fold, which hangs the cardiac tube, it is called the mesocardium. Okay, it is seen dorsally, so it is called dorsal mesocardium. Fate of these structures, this endothelial heart tube, you can see in the center, the arrow, just see the arrow, it forms the endocardium, the innermost lining of the heart. Then the myoepicardial mantle, the outer surface, the outer part, that brown color, that will give rise to the myocardium and epicardium. Then the pericardial coelom, the outer clear part, it will give rise to the pericardial cavity or the serous pericardium, with the part that closely covers the heart, it is the visceral layer, and the outer part is the parietal layer. Now we can see what happens to the cardiac tube. Now it is a single tube with veins draining on one side, and the blood is passing through the tube and it is continuing at the arterial end and it is supplying through the dorsal aorta. Okay, but so it has got an arterial end and a venous end. All for now. Now what happens is there appears a single constriction between the arterial end and the venous end, or almost in the middle between the, okay. Then secondary constrictions appear on either in between, and there are several bulges and constrictions by the time. Now you can name these bulges. From the arterial end, it is the truncus arteriosus, then comes the bulbus cordis, then the primitive ventricle, primitive atrium, and sinus venosus. These are the 5 bulgings. So the first constriction was between the ventricle and the atrium. Note it is a primitive atrium and the primitive ventricle. Later, above the ventricle, there will be another constriction and 2 constrictions. With that, we can divide it into a truncus arteriosus, bulbus cordis, and the middle part of bulbus cordis is also called the conus cordis, close to the ventricle. Then the primitive atrium and the sinus venosus is considered as the venous side. This is the first change that can be seen. Now there are changes in the shape that will occur, because you have seen that this cardiac tube was dorsal to this coelom and it will be hanging down into the coelom, and the coelom is a very narrow and restricted space, but the heart will start enlarging so that it will be thrown into folds and will be accommodated in that limited space. So there will occur some changes accordingly, and the first change is this will become a loop, a U-shaped curve. Okay, the major part, the first part that starts to elongate is the bulbus cordis and the ventricular part. Okay, the arterial and venous end will be fixed, and the first part to enlarge is the bulbus cordis and the ventricular part. So that will form the bulboventricular loop, and that will be looping to the right side. Okay, so now the tubular heart is now a U-shaped heart. Then what happens? The venous end starts to enlarge. The atrium and the sinus venosus starts to enlarge, and it will move upwards and dorsally, so that the entire thing is now, see the second picture, it is S-shaped. Okay, that enlargement and movement of the atrium will produce this U-shaped bulboventricular loop into that S-shaped heart. Then the atrium will occupy, it will enlarge, and it will come on either side of this bulbous cordis like your ear. That is why that part is called the auricle. So now it becomes a box shaped or something, and then the differential enlargement and growth that will give rise to the adult type of heart, where the apex will be formed by the ventricle and will be directed to the left and anterior. So all these will occur with the first looping of the bulboventricular part to the right side. That is very, very important. Though it is genetically controlled and many factors that controls this looping, it is very important, otherwise the heart will be directed to the other side. Okay, then this looping, if it occurs to the left, the heart will be, the entire heart will be a mirror image of what you are going to see in the adult normally. Okay, the large arteries will be on the opposite side, the apex will be on the right side, like that. So that condition is called the dextrocardia. The heart is directed to the right. The initial abnormality is occurring in the looping at the bulboventricular loop. Normally the bulboventricular loop occurs to the right, but here comes the reverse looping, it is coming to the left. Now second thing is clinical importance. This cardiac pole or the cardiac activity, I told you, it will be, though it can be demonstrated at 22nd or 23rd day by ultrasound, it can be demonstrated by 27th to 28th day, by the end of 4th week or by the beginning of 5th week. So when there is a major cardiac defects which is incompatible to life, sometimes it will be incompatible to life and the baby will die, but sometimes the baby will born with these defects, and if it is a major defect, that is, you can advise an MTP or the termination of pregnancy. So you will know what happens next. Okay, how is it incompatible to life? Now what you know is that the venous blood enters and it passes through the cardiac tube and it leaves. And naturally you know it is not that simple in the adult. So there will be several changes that will be occurring so that we will prevent the mixing of deoxygenated blood from the oxygen coming in contact with the oxygenated blood. So now, and if there is a mixing, that will lead to a bluish discoloration of your body, it is called cyanosis, right? Yes. So now we will see what will happen to the interior of the heart so that these blood streams are separated. What happens in the interior? So now it is a section of that bulboventricular loop. You can see the cornus cordis or the bulbus cordis, the ventricle, and posteriorly in the upper part it is the atrium. So there is an atrioventricular canal. Can you see this? This is the atrium and this is the ventricle. So this is the atrioventricular canal. This is the cross section, and here there are two endocardial cushions developing, a dorsal and a ventral cushions developing, and these will meet and there will develop an septum in the atrioventricular canal. Between the atrium and the ventricle, now there is an atrioventricular septum developing. Okay, this septum is called the atrioventricular septum or the septum intermedium. So by this dorsoventral septum intermedium, this atrioventricular canal is now divided into a right and a left atrioventricular canal. That is the first thing that occurs. Can you see in this picture lower down? It is a septum intermedium and it divides the atrioventricular canal into a right atrioventricular canal from the right atrium to right ventricle and a left atrioventricular canal on the left side. Okay, now we can go to the development of atrium. Though we are describing it one by one, actually there are many changes occurring simultaneously. Though we are going to describe the atrium first, at the same time there will be changes occurring in the ventricle as well. Okay, there are several septations. First thing is a septum intermedium. Now next we are going to describe the interatrial septum or the development of atrium. So if you want to describe about the atrium, we have to start with the sinus venosus, because the atrium is the receiving end of the veins in the adult, but in the fetus these veins are collected by the sinus venosus. Sinus venosus means a venous sinus, that is a venous pool. All these veins come together to form a sinus before it enters the atrium, simply. So it is a primitive atrium and sinus venosus. And there are 3 veins draining to the sinus venosus on either side. Okay, so these 3 veins together forms a horn of the sinus venosus. So there will be a right horn draining 3 veins, left horn with another 3 veins. These two unite to form the body of sinus venosus, which will be draining into the atrium. One is the umbilical vein that you know from the placenta, which is taking the oxygenated blood. Through the umbilical cord, it will be coming to the body. Second is the vitelline vein. It is the veins coming from the yolk sac. These are the first formed veins and they will be taking the nutrients. Then third is the cardinal veins. Cardinal means very important, and they are the veins from draining the embryo, that germ disc or the embryo. After folding you can call it as an embryo, and from the body wall of the embryo they are called the cardinal veins. And there will be an anterior cardinal vein from the head region, and there will be a posterior cardinal vein from the tail region or hind region. These together unite to form a common cardinal vein, and this common cardinal vein on the right side and the left side, they will be draining to the corresponding horns of the sinus venosus. So all these veins, there is a right umbilical vein, left umbilical vein, right vitelline, left vitelline, and right common cardinal and left common cardinal. So these are the 3 sets. You can see it in the diagram. The anterior cardinal and posterior cardinal unite to form the common cardinal on either side. Then there are the vitelline veins and the umbilical veins. Okay. So they will be draining to the 2 horns of sinus venosus, and the body will be draining to the sinoatrial orifice between the sinus venosus and the atrium. Initially it was in the center. It was actually a continuous like that. Then what happens is, during the development there will be several shunts between the left and right side will develop, and the left side many veins will degenerate, regress. Okay, and the right one will develop more. So what happens? This left horn of the sinus venosus also will regress, and the right horn will enlarge. Okay, and the opening also, the sinoatrial opening also will be shifted from the center to the right. So now it is like the sinus venosus draining these main veins. It is opening to the right part of the atrium. The left horn, it has been shrinked And now it can be considered or it can be seen as a tributary of the right horn. Okay, and the sinoatrial orifice is shifted to the right side. Here you can see the right common cardinal vein, it remains. In the diagram you see, this common cardinal vein is later, it is forming the superior vena cava. Okay, then see the umbilical vein. The right umbilical vein will be gone and the left umbilical vein will be left behind, but it will not be draining directly to the heart. Now about the vitelline vein, the left vitelline vein is gone and the right vitelline vein, later you will see it will form a part of inferior vena cava. Okay, and so the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava, that is, they will be opening to the right horn, and the left horn is shrinked or reduced and it will form the coronary sinus. That also will be draining to the right horn. Okay, lower down another picture you can see the right horn is represented by a light blue color and left horn by a dark blue, and the sinoatrial orifice was in the center. Now the dark blue part is shrunken, is reduced in size, and that will form the coronary sinus, and the sinoatrial orifice has been shifted to the right. What happens to the interior? See the interior of the atrium. You can see that sinoatrial orifice is reduced into a vertical slit, say SA orifice slit, guarded by a right venous valve and a left venous valve, and this right and left venous valve unite in the upper part to form a septum spurium. Okay, then what happens? This is the right and left venous valve. Gradually what happens is this right venous valve will enlarge and the sinus venosus, the right horn and the body, it will be taken into, absorbed into the right part of the atrium, the posterior wall. Okay, so that will be enlarged and absorbed into the right atrium, and that will form the posterior wall of the right atrium, whereas the atrium proper will be forming the anterior wall. Okay, that right venous valve also you can see it is enlarging and enlarging, so that will demarcate the line between the original sinus venosus and the proper right atrium. Fate, we can see what was happening to all these structures. This right horn will form the posterior smooth part of the right atrium. When you open the heart, the right atrium, you can see the posterior part is smooth and they will call it as sinus venerum. Now you know why you are calling it as sinus venerum, because it was originally the sinus venosus. Okay, and I told you all these veins are draining into sinus venosus part. So now you know the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, the coronary sinus, all will be opening to that smooth part of the right atrium in the adult heart. Then left horn of the sinus venosus, you can see here it is reduced and it is called coronary sinus, which is placed between the atrium and ventricle, that purple colored. Okay, now see the interior, the right venous valve will give rise to the crista terminalis, a prominent feature between the smooth posterior part and the rough anterior part. It is derived from the right venous valve. And in the picture, from the picture, you can also see that the crista terminalis, though it forms, major part forms the crista terminalis, the lower part forms the valve of inferior vena cava and the valve of the coronary sinus. Now what happens to the left valve? It is absorbed into the interatrial septum. This is the interior of the right atrium. You will be seeing. See, anteriorly there was that crista terminalis between the rough part and the smooth part. Posteriorly it is smooth, where all these veins will be opening. The superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, coronary sinus and all. Now, what happens to the left part of the atrium? Behind the left part, a vein will be developing from the angiogenic cells. They are called the pulmonary veins. Initially a single vein will develop and that will drain into that left part. These veins will be branching into two, right and left. Again they will be dividing into two, rebranching. Then this pulmonary vein also is getting absorbed into the posterior part of the left atrium. So finally the initial trunk, the two divisions, all these will be getting absorbed, so that finally the picture is these four veins independently opening into the posterior part of the left atrium. That will be the picture. So the left atrium, it will be derived from the absorbed pulmonary veins and the primitive atrium and the part by the atrioventricular canal. Now we can see we are talking about the right part of the atrium and the left part of the atrium, or right atrium and left atrium. So before you can call it a right atrium and left atrium, there will be a septum that will be developing in between the two. It is called the interatrial septum. That interatrial septum development is very important because you should know the developmental basis of the atrial septal defect. So first, in the atrium, a common atrium, a crescentic fold starts to develop from the roof of the atrium. From the roof, a crescentic fold, it starts growing downwards towards the septum intermedium or the atrioventricular septum canal. Okay, so there will be all these veins. Now you know it is coming to the right part of the atrium, and through that gap between the septum primum and the septum intermedium, it will be going to the left part of the atrium, and the blood will be flowing down through the right and left atrioventricular canal. Okay, that will be the picture. So when the septum primum is coming towards the septum intermedium, there will be a gap between the lower convex margin of the septum primum and the septum intermedium. That defect or that opening is called the foramen primum or the ostium primum. Ostium means just an opening. Primum means it is the first formed. Okay, it is the septum primum is the first formed septum. Between these two, it arises from the dosum or the roof of the atrium, and that will come towards the septum intermedium, and the gap existing between these two is the opening or the ostium primum. Now what happens? Anyway, this will be closed completely as the septum fuses with the septum intermedium. With a contribution from the septum intermedium, it will be fusing, closing. So as it closes, there will be an opening produced, a small openings in the cranial end or the upper end of the septum primum. You can see several small openings in the upper part. and they fuse, and that part of the septum primum will degenerate, and that will form another opening for the smooth flowing of this blood. This is called the foramen or the ostium secundum. Okay, so just remember that the ostium primum is between the septum primum and the septum intermedium, and the ostium secundum is seen in the septum primum. Okay, now by this time there will be that venous opening, sinoatrial opening seen, and between that opening and the septum primum, a thick bulky septum, a second septum starts to develop downwards. Okay, that also is crescentic, but it is thick and bulky. The entire space between the septum primum and the left venous valve is occupied by this second septum. So that is called the septum secundum. Septum secundum is seen on the right side of the septum primum. It will be growing downwards, covering the ostium secundum, covering that opening, that second opening produced in the upper part. It will be growing downwards. Okay, now there is a oval shaped defect formed at the lower end of the septum secundum. Okay, an oval shaped with a thick upper margin. So now the blood flows from the sinus venosus, it reaches the right atrium, and from the right atrium through this oval opening, then between the septum secundum and septum primum, then through the ostium secundum or the upper border, it reaches the left atrium. So that a sinuous course, that is called the foramen ovale. Foramen ovale. Okay, so the septum secundum is thick and sturdy, and the lower part through which, now you can see in this picture the flow of venous blood. You can see the septum primum in the first picture, then it grows down, and you can see upper left there is a foramen primum between the septum primum and the septum intermedium. Okay, then as it fuses with the septum intermedium, lower right side, you can see the upper part degenerates and there will be an opening. It is called the foramen secundum. Then the septum secundum starts to develop between the septum primum and the left venous valve, covering this foramen secundum and comes down. So now the blood has to flow below the septum secundum, then between the septum primum and secundum, then above the septum primum to reach the left atrium. This is called the foramen ovale. Then now you see that all these veins is coming, even the umbilical vein is coming to the right atrium. So that all these blood will be flowing, and the septum primum was very thin and it is flap like, just like a flap. But the septum secundum is very strong and sturdy. Okay, so all this blood is now coming from the right side, then it will be pushing the septum primum and it will be flowing to the left atrium. Okay, see, all this blood will be coming to the right atrium, then it will be pushing the septum primum and it will be reaching the left atrium. That is okay, because there in the left atrium no blood is coming. It is only the pulmonary veins which is coming from the lungs while the baby is inside the womb, the lungs are not functioning, so there is no oxygenated blood or inside the left atrium, so nothing is there to resist the movement of the septum primum. Okay, so what happens to this foramen ovale after birth? Once the baby comes out and takes the first breath, the lungs will be expanding and the pulmonary veins will be functioning, and there will be oxygenated blood inside the left atrium. Okay, so what happens? The pressure here increases in the left atrium, and that will push the septum primum towards the septum secundum, so that this blood, this interatrial septum is now become steady. There is no interatrial flow. You got it? Once with the first breath of the baby, the blood pressure inside the left atrium increases, and that will push the septum primum, like the flap, towards the septum secundum, and that will close that foramen ovale, the flow. Okay, but it is only a functional closure, and after months, by 6 months or so, there will be anatomical closure too. While you get a specimen of the heart in the adults, while even if you are trying to see that gap, it will not be there. There will be anatomical closure. Sometimes on the left side, in the left atrium of the interatrial septum, you can see the upper free border of the septum primum. Okay, like just a lunar, semilunar defect. Otherwise, it will be closed. That is the anatomical closure. But in 15 to 20% of people, if you try to pass a probe from the right atrium through the interatrial septum, this septum primum, you can separate it, and that probe will be passing to the left side. It is called a probe patency of foramen ovale. It is dangerous because if everything other is normal, that septum primum will be closed functionally. It will be opposed to the septum secundum because every other thing is normal. The left atrial pressure will be greater, so that even if a probe can pass, functionally it will not affect that person. Now, see this case. In OP, a case, a 23-year-old male presented with complaints of breathlessness on exertion and feeling of fatigue. See, it is only at 23 years. After investigation, an ASD was diagnosed, an atrial septal defect. There was a defect in the interatrial septum. He was not cyanotic and was asymptomatic till recently. According to him, there was no symptoms. He functions normally and all. Okay, now why is that? And there was an ASD that has to be closed. Can you see? ASD, the atrial septum. Now you know how the interatrial septum is developing. Initially there was a defect. Normally, naturally there was a defect, the ostium primum, and later there was another defect. It was called ostium secundum, and later there was a foramen ovale. Okay, so if, and usually all these will be closed and there is no communication between the right and left atrium. So why is there an ASD occurs congenitally? Sometimes the ostium primum might not have closed completely. Ostium primum, lower down, near the atrioventricular cushion. Okay, so that is called the ostium primum type of ASD. Sometimes what happens, that ostium secundum, do you remember, in the upper part, that becomes much large, very large opening. That is, the septum primum has resorbed much more than it could be covered by septum secundum, so that there will be a defect, a persisting defect. Sometimes that ostium secundum was normal, but the septum secundum was very small, so that also will lead to a defect in the ostium secundum. So these are called the ostium secundum type of defects. Okay, and the other one is your patency of the foramen ovale. So the ASD you can classify it as ostium primum defect or the lower septal defect near the atrioventricular cushion. And I hope you know the atrioventricular cushion means, or septum means, between the atrium and ventricle, which are the same cushions will give rise to the atrioventricular septa. Which is the right atrioventricular septa? They are the tricuspid valves. On the left side it is the mitral valves. Okay, so this defect, the ostium primum type of defect, will be close to the atrioventricular septa. Second is the ostium secundum or the upper septal defect. It can be seen almost in the middle of the atrial septum. I told you it is either because of a large resorption of ostium secundum, a large foramen secundum, or a small septum secundum. Okay. Second is the patent foramen ovale, or it can be even a probe patency. And these are the different types of ASD. Okay, and there are many more that you can study later. A basic type, these are the three basic types. Okay, ostium primum type, ostium secundum type, and the patent foramen ovale. And all these, if it is a very small defect, it will not create any symptoms and it will be closed spontaneously. If it is mild, it is moderate to large, it has to be closed either surgically or with any device. Okay, device closure. You can pass a device through any of your veins, usually a leg vein in the groin. That will be passed through the inferior vena cava. It will be entering the right atrium, and in the right atrium you can approach the interatrial septum and you can place a device there. It is called a device closure. Okay, anyway it can be closed. Now my question is, I have given you a case scenario previously in a person, 23-year-old person who was asymptomatic till that year. He was not cyanotic and now he is feeling breathless. It was not due to corona because it was breathless and there was exertional dyspnea, difficulty in breathing. And can you tell me why it has been so late to have a breathlessness? Why isn't? You now know the developmental basis of the ASD. Either it will be a defect in ostium primum or it will be a defect in ostium secundum. Whatever it is, why is he breathless now? Usually what happens? Will there be a mixing? If there is a defect in the atrial septum, usually the atrial pressure on the left side is greater and the oxygenated blood will be coming to the right atrium. How will it produce a breathlessness? That is your assignment for this class. You have to write it down. I will post an assignment. You just write it down and post it. Which are the developmental sources of the interatrial septum and why is he breathless at this age? You just imagine and write an answer. Okay, so to summarize, the heart, it develops in the cardiogenic area, the cranial most part, between the septum transversum and the buccopharyngeal membrane. Then after folding this planktopleuric mesoderm, it comes dorsal to the pericardial cavity. Then it will hang down, and I forgot that there was a mesocardium between the arterial end and the venous end. Later it will break down, and in the adult there will be a sinus in the pericardium between the arterial end and venous end. It is called the transverse sinus. That is a developmental basis of transverse sinus. It is normally. Okay, now to summarize, this endothelial heart tube will unite craniocaudally to a single heart tube. Then there will be several constrictions developing, the truncus arteriosus, conus cordis or the bulbus cordis, ventricle, atria, and the sinus venosus. Okay, then you have seen a U-shaped heart with a bulboventricular loop and an S-shaped heart by the enlargement of the atrium and displacement of atrium. Then you are trying to see the sinus venosus, which were the veins draining and what are the changes that is happening. Then how is the sinus venosus absorbed into the right part of the atrium. Then you also seen the left atrium, which was developing from the absorption of the pulmonary veins. On the right side, you just knew the superior vena cava from the common cardinal vein, the inferior vena cava from the right vitelline vein. That too. Okay, so all these veins will be draining into the right atrium. Then you saw the development of interatrial septum and the basis of atrial septal defect. So with that, we can finish the class today. So this is the type, the ostium primum type, ostium secundum type, and you can see this is the ostium primum will be very close to the tricuspid valve because they are all coming from the atrioventricular septum, and the ostium secundum type almost come in the middle. Though there are several other types, we are not going into the details. These are the two basic types you should know. Okay, so with that we will finish and you submit your assignment today itself. Thank you.